Live. I'm your host and presenter, Osman Butt, also a video producer. And my guest today is Reza Zia-Ebrahimi. Reza teaches at King's College London and is a senior lecturer at King's College London. He specializes in the history of nationalism, race, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and conspiratorial thinking. Reza, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Osman.
So, France. In the last few months, we've seen one some would describe as an upping of Islamophobic rhetoric coming from the French government, with Emmanuel Macron talking about a crisis of Islam globally, and his ministers talking about various measures within France to help integrate Muslims into French life. What is it about? What is it about French politics that makes this kind of policy or these kinds of rhetoric resonate so much?
Well, perhaps I should start by saying that Islamophobia is a global phenomenon which exists across the board. In the Western world, it is particularly prevalent, and I subscribe to theories that have been put forth by some of my colleagues, whereby the main promoter or the main engine behind the rise of Islamophobia is actually the state and the system of surveillance that it has put into place, particularly since 9/11, of course, although I claim that Islamophobia is something that goes back to the Middle Ages and sort of like morphs and adapts itself to new situation. That being said, we are also discovering at the moment that Islamophobia operates in other theaters. Suffice it to think about the internment of the Uyghur population in China, the treatment of the Rohingyas in both in Myanmar and Bangladesh, and of course India, and so on and so forth. Let us also bear in mind that there are specific strands of Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries themselves. And the sort of Iranian nationalism that I have analyzed in my previous book, which I refer to as dislocative nationalism, has a very strong element of anti-Muslim rhetoric that is built into it. And one could also mention Kemalism. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have in the past few years seen legislations being enacted to ban the full veil, for instance, in places where the veil had never been a topic of discussion or debate. So we are really dealing with a global phenomenon. And as a historian, I like to point out that it has very deep historical roots. And I sometimes sense that the sociological analysis of Islamophobia today tends to lack precisely the historical depth that is needed to fully grasp the phenomenon. Now, all of that being said, I do believe that France, to some extent, is exceptional, and this for many reasons. Obviously, there are some elements of legislation that exist in France, which are quite exceptional. There is no equivalent of the veil ban at school, which you have in France since 2004, in this country, for instance, or even in the United States or elsewhere. Where France really is exceptional, in my view, is in the sort of like universal consensus behind Islamophobia denialism. So once again, the denial of racism is nothing exceptional. I think it is something that you find across the board in white majorities in societies where racism is a problem. In the United States, it's been analyzed by Robin DiAngelo recently under the title of White Fragility. Suffice it to think that a very significant proportion of white Americans believe that not only is racism not a problem, but that they are the target of a form of discrimination, which is quite interesting. And I do believe that the denial of Islamophobia inscribes itself into this larger, broader context of pushing back against the anti-racist discourse, the anti-racist analysis. In some ways, it is a reaction about the loss of white privilege or the loss of white supremacy, and you have very interesting parallels of reactions against feminism, for instance. So all of this, there is this very broader, much larger context of our age that needs to be taken into account. However, Islamophobia denialism in France is different because, as I said, is practically universally upheld by all the major figures of the political and intellectual elite in France. The invocation of Islamophobia in France carries a very, very high cost, as the outlawing of the Committee Against Islamophobia in France recently by the French Prime Minister Darmanin is there to remind us of. So sometimes, if you compare with the United Kingdom, for instance, the Conservative Party in power has declined, is the only party in this country that has not adopted the definition of Islamophobia that was recently put forth by a cross-party consensus. And Prime Minister Boris Johnson has decided not to investigate accusations of Islamophobia within the Tory party. All of that being said, nobody, including the Prime Minister, denies the existence of Islamophobia. They might deny that it is a problem, they might accommodate it, or even try to benefit from it. And I would argue that this is to some extent true of the government, given that they have never distanced themselves from Britain First, for instance, that has very openly claimed or openly declared their support for the current government. So what I'm trying to say here is that maybe nothing is done about Islamophobia, but nobody at that level of political authority would deny its very existence. So possibly the most famous Islamophobia denialist in this country would be Melanie Phillips, who is a figure that, in my view, lingers on the fringes of the public sphere. The other one being Tommy Robinson, etc. In France, it is quite different. Islamophobia denialism is bang at the center of the mainstream. It is the most commonly held position. Any discussion of Islamophobia, any invocation of Islamophobia for the past 20 years has been sabotaged by Islamophobia denialism. The invocation of Islamophobia, as I said earlier, carries a high price. Today, essentially, you find yourself being accused of supporting jihadism by the government, not by people on the fringes of society, by the government, the elected government of the French Republic, by the Prime Minister of the French Republic. There are figures like a chap called Eric Zemmour. I don't know to what extent the people listening to us are familiar with this figure. It's sort of similar to Melanie Phillips, or a cross between Melanie Phillips and Tommy Robinson, if you will. This chap has a regular column in Le Figaro, which is the most mainstream right-wing newspaper in the country, and also appears practically on every talk show on French TV that you could think of, all the while complaining about being censored. So it's quite interesting. So it's the phenomenon itself of Islamophobia, or the phenomenon itself of Islamophobia denialism, which is part and parcel of Islamophobia, is not exceptional. It's the fact that it is mainstream and practically universally held in France. that sets France apart. And let me conclude this point by also saying that Islamophobia and Islamophobia denialism in France transcends traditional political camps. There is this misconception, in my view, that it is a far right thing. Obviously, there is Islamophobia in the far right. It is very much prevalent, in fact, on the far right. However, a lot of the iterations of Islamophobia that we talk about, or that we will talk about today, the threat to secularism and laïcité, the threat to French Republican values, quote unquote, and so on. These are ideas that come from the left, and the people that have initiated them are people that are traditionally associated with the French left. They have been very critical of the left in many ways. But that being said, these are not, we cannot consider them as part of the far right by any stretch of the imagination. So this is where we stand today, and this is why I'm not surprised that President Macron has recently decided to tap into this reservoir of images and so on. I believe that for at least the past 20 years, every single French president, particularly since Sarkozy, has been very keen, of the left or the right, have been very keen to tap into the far right electorate by being tough on Islam, by disciplining expressions of Muslimhood, as my colleagues Abdul Karim Vakil and Salman Saeed would say. So his recent speech on separatism and recent legislation that is going to be discussed in January in the French Parliament came as no surprise to me. I wish I could say that France is a polarized society, but on this matter there is practically universal consensus, certainly within the elites, within the political and the intellectual elites. So this is where we stand.
Thank you very much for that. So two French intellectuals I wanted to talk about, because you've written about Pascal Bruckner and also Kamal Daoud. I think this is an interesting one because Kamal Daoud obviously comes from one side of the spectrum and Pascal Bruckner comes from a different, but in a way they both represent two sides of a different Islamophobic discourse. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm very well acquainted with the work of Pascal Bruckner. Bruckner very much personifies what I just described. So this is a chap who comes from the left, who participated in the 1968 uprising, but then became critical of it very quickly. And with a lot of his colleagues that used to refer to themselves as the new philosophers in the 1970s. So I'm referring to Bernard-Henri Lévy, Alain Finkielkraut, Glucksmann, etc. A number of them who all hail from the left and who came to prominence in the 1970s when they formulated a critique of Soviet totalitarianism, particularly after the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. And they were given a hard time by the sort of like the hardcore Orthodox French Communist Party and sort of like Orthodox Marxists. But it's this critique of the Soviet Union that explains their huge success in the French public sphere, in the media particularly. And Pascal Bruckner is one of them. Bruckner, so in the division of labor of this critique of the left, which expanded into every single manifestation of the left, from Marxism to the idea of revolution, Bolshevism, 1968, the sexual mores of 1968, and so on. Bruckner's speciality, if you will, was a critique of third worldism, which he interprets as Western self-hatred. So the West hates itself because it colonized the rest of the world. and that presumably is wrong. So the dominant ideology of the West is self-hatred. He came to prominence in 1983 by writing a book about that topic. And I think that some of these intellectuals, including Bruckner, were kind of like losing speed. Their careers in the 90s, this criticism of the Soviet Union was not really relevant anymore. And they sort of like pivoted to a criticism of Islam, stroke Islamism, stroke jihadism. So I argue that the boundary between particularly Islam and Islamism is always deliberately blurred. And a lot of expressions of Muslimness, such as the wearing of the Islamic hijab, are automatically interpreted as sympathy for jihadism, support for jihadism or Islamism, etc. So he sort of like strikes back in the noughties with a critique of Islam, which is essentially couched in the same terms. So you take his old text and you replace Gulag with Islam, and you pretty much have the more recent text. He has an audience that is receptive to this idea of and this anti-totalitarian ideology, and not that he is the most influential Islamophobic denialist, but I worked on him because he actually managed to write a whole book on the topic, a book that was published in France in 2017 called Un Islam imaginaire, un racisme imaginaire, an imaginary racism. Well, guess what that racism is, which was translated into English the following year. So I devoted some of my work on analyzing this piece, and I came to several conclusions. First of all, the first conclusion was that the sort of the doctrine of Islamophobia denialism, because it's something that has sort of like very identifiable tenets, that this is an Islamist conspiracy, the invocation of Islamophobia is an Islamist conspiracy to silence legitimate criticism of Islam, that the term was coined by the Islamists, so depending on the version, it's either the Iranian mullahs in 1979 or sort of like British jihadist organizations and so on. But essentially the ideological construct of Islamophobia denialism, be it in France or Britain or the United States or wherever, is essentially the same. And that's what struck me as very interesting. And as an intellectual historian or historian of idea, it sort of like indicated that there is a source somewhere that needs to be found. And I found this source in France again. So that's why France is so central, is because the most common form of Islamophobia denialism from a doctrinal perspective that you find today finds its origin in a French text from 2003, written by a lady called Caroline Fourest and her partner, Fiammetta Venner. So these are two LGBTQ activists who in 2003 were absolutely unknown in France, let alone the rest of the world. However, the piece contains in a nutshell the main sort of like ideological postures of Islamophobia denialism. And later on, Caroline Fourest became a bit of a celebrity by criticizing Tariq Ramadan and having many televised rhetorical duels with Ramadan. But so essentially, a study of Bruckner for me showed how, first of all, Islamophobia denialism in its origins is a French phenomenon which emerges in a context of national debate about the role of Islam in society and so on, the very specific form that the Muslim question takes in France. Secondly, it shows the trans-regional character of Islamophobia and Islamophobia denialism. So we have an international network of people that talk to each other, that know each other's work, that cite each other. And that's why suddenly you start to find Forrest ideas not only in Bruckner, but also in Robert Spencer in the United States, in Melanie Phillips over here, and so on and so forth. So it also shows the global character, the sort of the global network of echo chambers that needs to be analyzed. Thirdly, it highlighted the important role of figures hailing from the left in this discussion. Of course, all of this has been taken on by the far right, which of course is very ironic that the far right today finds inspiration in ideas that, at least technically, come from the left. So that's about Bruckner. So I think that Bruckner, in many ways, is representative and a topic worthy of, if not being read for the merits of his writings, at least to be studied. For me, he's an object of study. He's not something that society has anything to learn from when it comes to Islam, but his writing tells us about intellectual trends in French and global Islamophobia. Should I carry on with the other character, Kamel Daoud? Or
yes, if you could briefly tell us about that, because we've got another question after this.
So more briefly, perhaps, Kamel Daoud. Kamel Daoud is an Algerian political commentator and novelist of French expression. He wrote a novel a few years back that I read and thoroughly enjoyed, called The Meursault Investigation. It was a response to Albert Camus' The Stranger. So for those of you who don't know, Albert Camus was a French author, an Algerian French author. So he was a part of the settler population in Algeria. And was a great author in many ways, a great philosopher. And one of his novels, which is really a central novel, I think, in 20th century literary history, is called The Stranger. It's the story of this man who one day loses his mind, it seems, and kills an Arab on the beach. And it's very interesting that throughout Albert Camus, this novel and other novels, the Arab is always the indigenous Arab of Algeria, in other terms, is always this mute persona, this shadow almost in the background, doesn't have a voice. And it's Camus and it's the white settlers that speak on his or her behalf. And in The Stranger, the Arab is murdered and the protagonist goes on to be tried and so on. But we never know who this Arab is and why he was there and what it is that he had to say. Kamel Daoud, 50 years or so, 60 years later, wrote the Meursault investigation, which is in fact, it sort of like gives the voice back to the Arab. So the brother of the murdered Arab is speaking. And I thought that was a very interesting post-colonial experiment. And so I was very well disposed towards Kamel Daoud. Then I was asked by the Times Literary Supplement to review his op-eds. So he used to write op-eds on a very regular basis in a Algerian newspaper in French, but Algerian, called Le Quotidien d'Oran, the Oran daily newspaper. And there I sort of like realized a much more complex and much more, should I put it, Manichaean view of Islam and the West. First of all, there's a criticism of Islam, Muslims, Algerians, which is very sweeping and lacks complexity and very parochial as well, because he just assumes that whatever applies to his native city of Oran and Algeria can be applied to Morocco and Yemen and Iran and Pakistan in a very parochial way. And at the same time, there is an almost unconditional admiration for the West and how they do things in the West, women's rights and freedom and so on and so forth. And this is when I realized how successful he was in among identitarian intellectuals, not only in France. So he's very regularly invited to places such as Denmark and so on to give talks about free speech, the women's condition, and so on. So a very dichotomous, a very clash of civilization type of discourse, which is of course welcomed by the people I just mentioned. And the key episode in Kamel Daoud was an op-ed that he wrote for about the mass molestation of the Cologne New Year's Eve back in I think 2015 or 16.
In Germany, yeah.
Exactly. So he wrote a piece on that, blaming those mass molestations on the immigrant in a glorious singular and the sexual misery of the Arab male. Anyway, so he wrote that, fine. 19 colleagues and academics, French, British, American, found issue with that op-ed, and they simply wrote a counter op-ed where they criticized Kamel Daoud's sweeping generalizations, and I think there's a case to make that claim, and how his point of view sort of like tapped into old Orientalist cliches about the oversexed Arab male who is a threat to the virginity of the white females and so on. So anyway, they made that point. What happened next is very interesting because so it immediately catapulted Kamel Daoud to the pantheon of the heroes, or the victims rather, the martyrs of political correctness. So this was taken on immediately by the far right, and not only in France, as a cause célèbre. And in France, practically every single commentator, including Bruckner, of course, the prime minister at the time, Manuel Valls, a socialist prime minister, may I point out, came to his rescue, claiming that it was absolutely, unacceptable that he was being issued this secular fatwa, quote unquote, to silence him. And this for me is very interesting because here what is at play is a complete inversion of reality. Not only was Kamel Daoud not silenced, I would claim quite the contrary. It gave him more of a persona, more influence than ever before. But it's the 19th academics who dared to criticize his sweeping generalizations, some of whom I know personally, who received death threats, who were attacked verbally, generally copiously insulted in the media, and some of whom, particularly those in France, not those in Britain or the United States, interesting, but particularly those in France, feel that it has hurt their career, that they struggle to get promoted, that some of their colleagues don't talk to them anymore, etc. So there is really an inversion of the relationship of victimhood here, which I find, then again, absolutely characteristic of the Islamophobia denialism, because Islamophobia denialists claim that it is those who claim that could be potentially victims of Islamophobia, the invocation of Islamophobia, which is the problem, which is totalitarian in their own words, because it is an attack on free speech and so on. And that people such as Kamel Daoud that go on saying that all Arab males are oversexed and sexual predators are victims. So there's this inversion that is very, very interesting and very, very central to this whole debate. As I said, more specific to France than elsewhere.
Okay, in the 1 minute we have left, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Sorry, I thought we had an hour. I was
No,
just
it's the
I was just warming up. Um, what could I say? Do you have a question to
So
ask me?
I was wondering if you could sum up a little bit, and also because you mentioned that there's a connection to anti-Semitism. I don't know if you're able to do that in a minute, but if you could, it would be great.
Well, I would say only this. I see Islamophobia and anti-Semitism within a framework of racism. Obviously, I think that it's very important to consider both as forms of racism. And I think that, contrary to the wisdom of some of the listeners here today, it has not been the case so far. And even the field of anti-Semitism studies hesitate to call anti-Semitism a form of racism and would rather believe that anti-Semitism is something apart. And all the many points of contact between the racialization of Jews and Muslims and people of color have been obscured. One of the reasons why it is very important to study anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together is that they are both cases where a population that is initially defined in religious terms becomes racialized and becomes the target of not only stereotypes, but attempts in societies where they live as a minority to be dominated by the majority. And secondly, as someone who works on conspiracy theories, and in this context, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of world Jewish domination, the protocols of Zion, etc., and Islamophobic conspiracy theories of Islamization of Europe and so on, I believe that these two forms of racism shed light on each other because the target populations, the Jews and Muslims, have in different historical contexts not only been otherized and racialized, but they have also been turned into the main existential threats to Western civilization, because this is the end game of Islamization. This is the end game of world Jewish domination, is to destroy us as the West. And I think that it's very interesting to see the continuity of certain tropes from one to the other and try to problematize it and explain it. Of course, it's very unpopular. As you know, the Palestinian question casts a very long shadow on these matters, and studying anti-Semitism in light of anything really sometimes grants you the right to be accused of banalizing anti-Semitism. So this is an uphill battle, but I think that it's something that it makes sense from a historical and empirical perspective.
Dr. Reza Ebrahimi Zia, thank you very much. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. We will be back in the new year with more great conversations. Take care, everyone, and happy holidays.